Broadcasting from the center of the military universe, Fort Bragg, North Carolina. This is the 18th Airborne Corps Podcast, the official podcast of America's Contingency Corps.
Welcome back to the podcast. This is the 18th Airborne Corps Podcast, the official podcast of the 18th Airborne. We appreciate all the new listeners who have come to the show after our interview with Ken Burns. That was a big one for us. If you're new to the show, please leave a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. That will help others find the show. What is this show? What is the 18th Airborne Corps Podcast? Well, it used to be called the Doomsday Clock Podcast. We changed the name to reflect a broader focus. Here we talk about the 18th Airborne Corps history, but we also talk about current operations and events. We talk about ongoing issues. We talk about really everything related to the 18th Airborne Corps. This is about life, service, and legacy of the 18th Airborne. And what a show we have today. We have Professor H.W. Brands, one of the most prominent American historians working today. He's the author of more than 24 books. If you watch the History Channel often like I do, he is very frequently on these shows. You see him all the time. He's talking about World War II, FDR, the Cold War. He's written many bestsellers. But the book we're talking about here today is his 2016 book, The General versus the President. It's about the Korean War. And we're honored to have him to talk about this. Whether or not you've read that book, this is a great discussion. This is really something that you can get something out of. As the title of the book, The General versus the President, as it alludes to, this is about the face-off between Douglas MacArthur, the general, and Harry Truman, the president, at the brink of nuclear war in the midst of the Korean War. This was a critical Cold War moment for this country. And H.W. Brands brings so much wisdom to the telling of that moment. He has a ton of experience. He taught at Texas A&M University for 16 years, and then he joined the faculty at the University of Texas at Austin. Right now, he's a professor of history there. He's written more than 30 books. He's written about Andrew Jackson, Teddy Roosevelt, Civil War. His works have twice been selected as finalists for the Pulitzer Prize, and this book is a great one. I encourage you to read the book, and I encourage you to listen to this talk and tell others about this talk. So, here is H.W. Brands about the Korean War and about the confrontation between Douglas MacArthur and Harry Truman. This discussion has so much value for the Army today. It says so much about civil-mil relations, about the role of military advice, about the intersection of politics and war, about strategic decision-making. It's so valuable for our Army's leaders, our soldiers today. So here's that discussion. June 1950, North Korea invades South Korea, and Professor Brands, this is a real test of the Truman Doctrine, of President Truman's policy of containment, isn't it?
Yeah, the Truman administration had been thinking about where American interests lay. And for the most part, they didn't think that American interests lay on the mainland of East Asia. Strategy planners had been thinking in terms of an offshore line of defense running from Japan down through Taiwan into the Philippines. And they figured that there was simply nothing good that was going to come of a commitment to mainland Asia. There were simply too many Chinese for the U.S. Army, U.S. Marines to deal with. This was the thinking as of early 1950. But in the course of 6 months from January to June 1950, the political atmosphere in the United States changed. And in particular, Joseph McCarthy began taxing the Truman administration, the president himself, very heavily for being soft on communism. This is just a few months after the communist victory in China. And again, McCarthy would say that Truman was soft on communism, the State Department was infested with communist infiltrators. And when the attack came, Truman felt that he had to respond. There wasn't any advanced planning. There wasn't any grand plan for how the United States was going to save South Korea. But Truman reacted and got the United States involved in the war. And at that point, it seemed that, okay, the Truman Doctrine applies here. The Truman Doctrine was originally conceived for the Eastern Mediterranean. What it had to do with South China, the Sea of Japan, and Northeast Asia was something that Truman wasn't thinking of in 1947 and 1948 when the Truman Doctrine was first conceptualized. But this is the way it happened.
Thanks, Professor Brands. The book is The General versus the President, and really the Korean War has this kind of fascinating rivalry, this fascinating dichotomy between Truman and MacArthur. Truman, who'd been 82 days as vice president before FDR died, he is dwarfed in stature by MacArthur at this point. MacArthur is a legend in the United States and a legend in this part of the world, isn't he?
He is. And MacArthur had an aura around him. Part of it came from the fact that he had lived essentially the previous 20 years, 25 years in East Asia, in the Philippines for a while, and then he had been in Japan as the head of the American occupation force in Japan. And he had never come back to the United States for a victory parade, the way other generals had. And he simply felt more comfortable in theater and not coming back. But he also realized in some respects that if he came back, he might kind of be diminished because, of course, he would have to report to the president. And, then he would be simply one of the other generals who had been around. And he liked being the star of his own show. And when he was in Tokyo, running the American occupation, living at the American embassy, then he managed to orchestrate things entirely to his own specification.
You point out that MacArthur had, by this time, had theater commander's disease. And really, we talked to the Truman Doctrine was really thinking about Europe, and in MacArthur's mind, the world revolved around his theater. Isn't that right?
No, most definitely. MacArthur believed that wherever he was the center of whatever conflict was going on at the time. And he certainly thought that during World War II. He believed that the Pacific was the hinge of victory. And in the Cold War, he thought, he was in Japan. And so he thought Japan and East Asia was the key to victory in the Cold War. And in both instances, he was effectively overruled. In both instances, he was effectively wrong. But MacArthur was never one to acknowledge when he was wrong.
So MacArthur was a titanic figure. Truman really was not. But, Truman had a power that no person had ever had before. He found himself at the control of the atomic bomb.
Right. So Truman had the atom bomb. But he also had control of the United States. He was president of the United States at a time when American power was greater comparatively than the power of any country had been with respect to the world. The United States really stood atop the world in 1945 and for the decade or two after that. And Truman understood this, but he also understood something that was really important. That as powerful as the United States was, it was not omnipotent. It couldn't do everything. It could do any single thing that it set its mind to, but it couldn't do everything at once. And this is something that the Truman administration did not share with the world, that the United States at that time could not fight two wars at once. And this became the crux of the issue with MacArthur, because Truman always steadfastly believed that Europe was the central theater of the Cold War. And if the United States got deeply involved in the war in Asia, then the Soviets might jump the United States in Western Europe, and the U.S. wouldn't be able to respond.
And what MacArthur had to face the North Koreans was, in many ways, this was a hollowed-out army. This was not the force that defeated the Japanese Imperial Army in World War II.
By no means. In fact, it was a historic tradition in the United States for America to build up its army when the war began, usually waiting until war had been declared. Build up the army, use the army to win the war, to deal with the war. When the war is over, muster all the troops out. Americans had a long-standing aversion to standing armies. Standing armies were what overthrew republics in history, and Americans wanted nothing of it. Beyond that, they simply didn't want to have to pay the soldiers in peacetime when the soldiers were just sitting around, or worse than sitting around, they might get it in their heads that we should take over the government. And the United States had done this successfully with every war in American history up until World War II. And most Americans expected that would happen after World War II. And it began to happen. So the United States had 14 million people under arms or so at the end of World War II. And the great majority of them were mustered out very quickly. But in the period between 1945, 1946, and 1950s, at least American planners realized, well, wait, we can't get rid of them all because now we're in this competition with the Soviet Union. And while Americans did rely on America's advantage in weapons, at least until 1949, the atom bomb, you still needed to have a certain number of men in uniform. And so there was a move had begun to remobilize. In fact, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was created in 1949. And the United States had made a decision, okay, we're going to defend Europe. And some teeth needed to be put into that promise. And so the Army needed to be built up again. But that remobilization had only begun at the time of the beginning of the Korean War.
And as a result, at least partly as a result, the Korean War starts off poorly for the Americans.
Very badly. So the United States and the South Koreans were both taken entirely by surprise. There weren't any American troops on the ground. And so the South Korean forces, the Republic of Korea forces, had to try to hold on, and they didn't do well at first. MacArthur, before waiting for authorization from the Joint Chiefs of Staff or from the President, sent troops from Japan, from the occupation force in Japan, to South Korea. And then after the fact, he was given authorization to do that. But it was a difficult thing to do. No one had been preparing for it. And in fact, the United States, or I should say the American side, the South Koreans and the United States nearly were driven off the Korean Peninsula. And if that had happened, it would have been a whole lot harder to regain that.
One of the things we talk about in the Army, one of the Army messages, particularly in a time like this, where we are in a transition from, one war, the global war on terror, to potentially a great power competition, is no more Task Force Smiths. Basically, it's an argument against a hollowed-out, under-resourced force. So the initial fighting, the initial months of the war go very poorly, and then MacArthur pulls off this Incheon landing, this seaborne invasion, when really many analysts and even the Joint Chiefs of Staff, folks in the Pentagon, thought this would not be successful.
It was a striking thing for me as a historian to observe the relationship between MacArthur and the Joint Chiefs, because the Joint Chiefs refused to give MacArthur direct orders. They would give him instructions, they would give him suggestions, but they declined to say, you're going to do this, or you must not do that. MacArthur got it into his head that he could orchestrate this end run around the North Korean line and effect this amphibious landing at Incheon. And it was precisely because it was so risky that he believed it would succeed, because the North Koreans would realize that nobody would be crazy enough to try this. There were all sorts of logistical problems in terms of the tides and the narrow window being able to get the troops ashore and so on. And the Joint Chiefs, they all thought that this was reckless. But none of them were willing to tell MacArthur, you can't do it. And some of their reluctance was that, well, MacArthur, and in fact, as one of them said, what do we do if we give MacArthur an order and he disobeys? Because he would get away with it. And then they would really all be in a fix. Because the thing is that MacArthur outranked all of them, but he also had political heft that none of them had. And this was part of the secret of MacArthur's imperviousness to persuasion, that MacArthur had friends in Congress, and he was feeding them information. And the members of the Truman administration, the Joint Chiefs, understood that MacArthur could build a backfire against them in Congress, and it would lead to a real mess. So the Joint Chiefs basically said to MacArthur, you can do this, but it's on you. And they made him put it in writing that, this is going to succeed, so that if it failed, they could be very clear that it was his idea and he was going to take the blame for it. And I think that at the time of the launching of the operation of the invasion, I think most of the Joint Chiefs thought that it probably would fail, and then they would be rid of MacArthur. But it didn't happen that way. It succeeded. And, of course, then MacArthur's aura became even greater than ever. And definitely from that point forward, nobody could tell Douglas MacArthur anything.
And, we should say MacArthur outranked the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and all of the Joint Chiefs in that he was, by this time, a 5-star general. They were all 4 stars. And he also was a larger figure in global stature and in American stature, really.
Right, yeah. And so MacArthur was this larger-than-life character. There's no doubt about that. And that was really important in his thinking.
And so the Incheon landing, this incredible gamble pays off. MacArthur is right. And now MacArthur starts to think and say, we'll be home by Christmas.
So the success at Incheon dramatically changed the course of the war, because from a position of nearly losing the war and being driven off the peninsula, the U.S., Republic of Korea, and other UN forces were in a position where they nearly captured and destroyed nearly all of the North Korean army. The North Koreans fled north as quickly as they could, so they evaded capture. But nonetheless, it was very clear the momentum in the war had decisively changed. And at this point, MacArthur is in a position to say, see, I told you I could do this. And Truman, at this point, President Truman, got a little bit greedy because the UN authorization said that the United States would lead the UN forces to restore the status quo in South Korea, to drive out the invaders. It said nothing about going into North Korea, nothing about reunifying North Korea under the control of the Republic of Korea, that is South Korea. But Truman thought, oh boy, now I could really show my critics. They pointed out I had lost ground to the communists. Now I'm going to win back some ground. And this is something that had never been done in the Cold War. The Cold War is not that old, but still, to actually take territory away from the communists. So Truman gives MacArthur authorization to go ahead and cross the 38th parallel and go into North Korea and basically complete the job.
And well, he did so based on spectacularly bad advice he got from MacArthur, in that MacArthur told him that if you cross into North Korea, China will not enter the war.
Yeah, so this is a moment of, well, it's almost humiliating for the president. He repeatedly tried to get MacArthur to come back to Washington to brief him, the president, in person on what's going on in Korea. And MacArthur kept refusing to do it. He said, I'm too busy. I can't take time away from the war here. And so Truman basically, hat in hand, flew to Wake Island, flew 90% of the way, of the distance between them, to talk to MacArthur. And MacArthur still only gave Truman 2 or 3 hours of his time, and then he left abruptly. But in that time, MacArthur promised Truman that the Chinese would not enter the war, or if they did, his forces would annihilate them. And unbeknownst to MacArthur, Truman got this on record. And there was a stenographer who had come out with Truman, and she happened to be sitting in a porch off of the meeting room. And just sitting there, she did what stenographers do. She took all this down. So MacArthur is on record as saying that the Chinese will not enter the war, and if they do, they will be annihilated. And Truman kept this in his hip pocket just in case. Well, of course, the just in case happened.
And so we're now in October 1950, and of course, China does enter the Korean War that month. An enormous Chinese force enters the war and sets the American push back on its heels. 2 months later, so the book opens up or at least the prologue to the book, December 1950, a very fateful press engagement where Truman makes a couple of remarks that are, I think, seemingly offhanded that really set the Pentagon spinning.
So Truman was in a fix here because the rules of wartime that reporters were used to from World War II, for example, didn't seem to apply. Because first of all, Truman refused to call this a war, and he refused to basically put the security clamp down on discussions of the war effort that were common during World War II. So reporters could ask him questions, and he didn't like to say no comment. He took pride in being straight-talking Harry. You ask him a question, you're going to get an answer. But this was at a moment when American forces were reeling, and it looked as though the United States might lose all the ground. In fact, it rapidly was losing all the ground that it had gained since Incheon, and might be finally thrown back off the Korean Peninsula. The United States had nuclear weapons. And what are nuclear weapons for but for use in a case like this? And so Truman was asked, are nuclear weapons under consideration? And Truman I'm sure he had to think about this for a moment. What am I going to say? He didn't want to say, he didn't feel he could say no, because presumably that would just give license to the Chinese to think that they could do whatever they wanted. He needed to at least make them feel there's a possibility. On the other hand, he didn't want to say, yeah, but basically he said all of our weapons are under consideration, and they always have been from the beginning. And it's a pretty anodyne thing to say, except that then a reporter followed up. Does that include the atom bomb? He says, yes. And so Truman now is on record as saying the atom bomb is available for use in Korea. And then the next question was, and who will make the decision on the use of the bomb? And Truman, again, he didn't like any notion that he would second-guess his theater commanders. And so he said, well, the theater commander will have responsibility and decision-making authority over the use of the bomb. Well, first of all, that was wrong under law. The president is the one who has to make the decision. But secondly, since the theater commander was Douglas MacArthur, who had been agitating for the ability, for permission to increase, to widen the war and to take the war into China, this one set people all over the world to Twitter. In fact, the British, they were in the middle of a debate in the House of Parliament, and Britain was an ally of the United States in this effort. And when news came that Truman had said that MacArthur has his finger on the nuclear trigger, well, it just stopped the debate. And Clement Attlee, the prime minister, said, okay, I got to go to Washington, basically, to straighten the president out on this, or at least to find out what we've gotten ourselves into.
So what's the longer-term reaction from this statement? At a certain point, Truman realizes he made a misstep here.
Yeah, so it doesn't take but an hour or two for the White House to walk this one back a little bit and saying, no, yes, the decision will be in the hands of the president, and there's no imminent intention of using nuclear weapons. But he can't take it all the way back and say, no, we're not going to use them. But the reason that this was so worrisome for people is not simply that, well, okay, it might lead to the American atom bombing of China, but by this time the Soviet Union had nuclear weapons, and that was the critical thing. And China was a military ally of the Soviet Union. And if the United States bombed China using nuclear weapons, then the Soviet Union, for matters of its own credibility, would feel obliged to at least take some active response. And this was where Truman knew something that MacArthur didn't entirely know, but certainly the American people didn't know, and that is that the United States was in no position to defend Berlin, for example, or to defend Germany, or defend even France at this point, if the Soviets really made a concerted effort, because the United States had been stretched very thin, putting forces in Korea in just the 6 months that American forces had been there. And so if the Soviets decided, okay, we're going to respond to an American attack on China, on Chinese territory itself, even if it's, especially, I suppose, if it's a nuclear attack, we're going to respond not by coming to the aid of China in Northeast Asia, we're going to attack the United States in Western Europe. And that was the nightmare scenario for the Truman administration. That's why MacArthur had to be reined in.
Really, what were MacArthur's thoughts about employing the atomic bomb in the war with North Korea, about an atomic strike on China?
Well, in keeping with MacArthur's long-standing belief that wherever he was the center of world history at that moment, MacArthur had concluded that World War III had already begun. After all, the United States, American forces, his forces, were fighting communist forces allied with the Soviet Union. So his thinking was World War III has begun, and we're going to fight this thing. We're not going to back off. We're going to fight it because we're going to have it out with the communists sooner or later. Better now when things are to our advantage. Now, he was wrong about that. Things really were not to America's advantage. People in the Pentagon then, people in the Truman administration, basically they were hoping to buy 2 or 3 years' time because the mobilization, the rebuilding program would make it possible for the United States to defend what's going to be the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, and Western Europe with simply conventional forces by the end of that time. But if the United States had to go to the defense of West Germany in 1950, it would have had to resort to nuclear weapons very quickly, and nobody wanted to do that.
And so, end of 1950, the Chinese People's Liberation Army are just taking it to the American forces and the South Korean forces. The war kind of slogs on into 1951. So the war starts with a very unpopular president and a very popular general. And at a certain point, does opinion start to turn against MacArthur within the United States?
It's pretty clear that MacArthur is pushing things because the American public didn't want to fight another war just 5 years after the last war had been over. There were war hawks in parts of Congress. There were people who were egging MacArthur on. There were those who really wanted to go further to the defense of nationalist China. Chiang Kai-shek and the government of China had been driven off in 1949 to Taiwan. And so they would have probably been happy, at least they were happy with the idea of engaging China more deeply in a war. But they didn't know enough about strategy to realize that if the United States had gotten into World War III in 1950, it would have been a close call as to which side would win. And it certainly wouldn't be an easy war. So MacArthur wasn't fully aware of that. The American people, they had a sort of an innate reluctance to get involved in a war, but they still kind of liked MacArthur. But what really tipped things against MacArthur was when he continued to criticize the President of the United States and American policy in public. And he would do it in speeches, and he would do it in letters to the opposition, to the Republican leadership in Congress. And when he did that, then Truman decided he had to make a decision. Basically, he had to fire MacArthur, more precisely, relieve him of his command. And Truman's reasoning on this was, this isn't personal. And I'm willing to take Truman at his word on this. It wasn't personal. It was that the world couldn't tell who was making American policy. Was it the President of the United States, or was it Douglas MacArthur? And if the world couldn't tell, especially when the world seemed to be teetering on the edge of nuclear war, then that was a really bad thing for American policy. So Truman says to MacArthur, okay, you're relieved of your command. You're still, of course, a five-star general, but you're no longer in command of the UN and U.S. forces in Korea. Now, to MacArthur's credit, he didn't question for a moment Truman's right to do that. In fact, there were some people who thought that perhaps MacArthur almost deliberately had himself fired so he could come home and run for president against Truman, which is exactly what he did.
So April 51, Truman, really shows, expressed in your book, great patience. Finally, April 51 fires MacArthur with the idea that MacArthur might run for president in 1952 presidential election, which he does. MacArthur does not come across great in your book. He certainly takes credit for his subordinates' plans and visions. He is a man of just enormous ego. He's borderline insubordinate to the president. He certainly comes in for great criticism in your view here.
Yeah, and I will grant MacArthur this, that he was a brilliant military commander. He was personally quite brave, although it was held against MacArthur that during the entire period he was with American forces in Korea, he never spent one night in Korea. He'd always fly back to Tokyo and go to sleep in his bed in the American embassy there. But he was one who believed that he knew better what American interests were than the elected President of the United States. And that was the final crux of the matter. He knew more about military command than Harry Truman ever did, but he didn't understand politics. And part of the reason he didn't understand politics was he hadn't spent any appreciable time in the United States since the 1930s. And even then, he'd been pretty out of touch when he led the army against the so-called bonus army, the unemployed veterans of World War I, who were living in a tent city that he destroyed and had burned to the ground. So MacArthur didn't understand and certainly didn't respect the very important notion of civilian leadership of the military, that the elected President of the United States is the commander-in-chief. Now, again, he didn't dispute Truman's authority to fire him. He just deeply disputed Truman's wisdom in the way Truman was leading the United States in the Cold War. And it wasn't just Truman. There wasn't a president of MacArthur's adult life that MacArthur didn't think he was smarter than. So he thought this was the time. And in fact, when he first came home, it looked like a canny decision if it was made for those political reasons, because he was given a podium in the House of Representatives. He got to address a joint session of Congress. And this is in the early days of television, so the address was televised and carried on the radio. And MacArthur could give a bang-up speech. The speech that he gave that ends in "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away." Boy, this is one that had people crying, and they thought Douglas MacArthur was the greatest guy ever. But then he went out on the campaign trail, and it turned out he didn't have that political touch. And one of the reasons that he didn't, because he came off looking poorly by comparison with that other general who did have the popular touch, namely Dwight Eisenhower.
I think a lot of times when Army officers think about MacArthur, they think about an ideal of a leader who leads from the front and is around the troops and suffers the same conditions and is beloved by subordinates. And those things are not true. Not in the way that they're true with Ridgway, who assumes command of the American forces in Korea after MacArthur is relieved.
No doubt about it. In fact, after I wrote the book, I have been approached by veterans of the Korean War and children of veterans of the Korean War, and actually children of veterans of World War II. And to a person, the ordinary GIs detested MacArthur precisely for the reasons that you suggest, that he didn't share the suffering that they went through, that nobody ever thought of MacArthur as the GI's general, the way they did people like Matthew Ridgway.
Yeah, so we did cover a lot of ground here. If we can get maybe a key takeaway or two, what the book speaks to and what this confrontation, this face-off speaks to is civil-mil relations, and civil-mil relations have been a real critically discussed topic over the last 2, 3, 4 years. What are some takeaways in terms of the establishment or the reestablishment maybe of civil-mil norms and the relationship between military leaders and their civilian leadership?
During peacetime in American history, there never was an issue that came up between the military leadership and the civilian leadership. And during wartime, presidents I won't say they would always defer to the generals, but because the wars that America were fighting tended to be pretty much all-out wars, that the generals got what they wanted. They got what they said they needed. The difference in the Cold War, in fact, the difference in every American military conflict since World War II, is that these are limited wars. And the politics of the war is always at least as important as the military aspects of the war. And under those circumstances, it's more important than ever that the decisions be very clearly seen as coming from the political leadership, from the elected leadership, and not from the generals.
And so Truman, has a lot of good qualities. He acquits himself nicely in a lot of very tough situations here. And really, the truth is there's nothing in Truman's background that would have prepared him for either the position in which he found himself after FDR died or for the Korean War. Can you leave us maybe with some positive attributes of Truman throughout the Korean War?
Truman had a lot of political courage to take difficult decisions, to make the decisions the way he thought they ought to be made, and to abide by whatever happened. So when Truman fired MacArthur, in fact, it destroyed Truman's career. He left office the most unpopular president in American history. So first of all, you have to give Truman credit for courage. The second thing is that Truman knew his limitations, and he knew that he needed to have strong and good advisors. So he knew enough to bring George Marshall out of retirement. He knew enough to lean on Dean Acheson. He knew enough to surround himself with people he could trust, whose judgment he trusted, and listen to them to make the decisions that then could be enforced even against recalcitrants like Douglas MacArthur.
Well, look, we really want to be considerate of your time. We do appreciate your discussion here, Professor Brands. Any other key points we haven't considered about these two figures and about this clash?
I will say this, that Truman was very unpopular at the time he fired Douglas MacArthur, and for actually, certainly through the the end of his presidency. And Truman remained pretty unpopular until it became clear in the late 1980s and early 1990s that his vision of how the United States would win the Cold War turned out to be the correct one. MacArthur believed the United States would win the Cold War by fighting World War III. Truman believed that the United States would win the Cold War by not fighting World War III. What the United States needed to be was patient and firm. And this was the essence of Truman's containment policy. And the containment policy did not prove itself correct until 1991, when the Soviet Union dissolved. But at that point, that's when Truman's historical stock among historians and political science really takes off. So Truman now is considered to be one of the 5 or 6 greatest of American presidents. In 1951, 1952, he was considered one of the worst presidents. But it just goes to show that a president has to have that kind of vision.
Yeah, it's a fascinating discussion, and we do really consider Truman to be a real hero of the Cold War, and at the time, incredibly unpopular in the Korean War. So, Professor Brands, thank you so much for your time. We greatly value your wisdom, your insight here, and it's a great book.
Thank you. It's good to talk to you.
All right, sir. Thank you. Take care.